All right, guys, welcome back. This is section 2.2, and we're going to continue on with our discussion of kind of investigating and prosecuting cyber crimes. All right, so last time we talked about local, state, and federal law enforcement. We're going to begin this subsection with talking about civil investigation. Okay, when we talk about law enforcement, that is a criminal investigation, but there's also civil investigation. So criminal law is a very small part of the law. If you go to law school, you're going to learn very little about criminal law. The vast majority of what you're going to learn about is civil law. Okay? With criminal law, somebody is at risk of going to jail or prison, essentially. With civil law, nobody's at risk of going to prison, usually. It's about suing somebody, or divorces or civil law, all the kind of non-criminal legal systems. So there's tax law and maritime law and family law and all these other different subsets of law that are completely separate from the criminal law system. These guys have a big need for to investigate cybercrime as well, and to use the same techniques that law enforcement does to investigate these criminal, or sometimes not criminal, but these legal issues, right? So, for instance, I have actually been a digital forensics examiner for a divorce case. One member of the divorce had an old computer, and for some part of the divorce, she needed some chat logs gotten off this old hard drive. So I did a digital forensics analysis, got the chat logs off, and then presented them in court at her divorce proceedings. There is probably just as much, if not much more, need for non-law enforcement investigation and training in this area. It's a much bigger need and is growing all the time. I was working very closely with a law enforcement agency, and one of their lead investigators was a police lieutenant, and he got hired away by a major car company. They paid him a whole bunch more than he was making as a police officer to come run a digital forensics facility for this corporation. And so now he works with them, and he's able to, do all kinds of corporate, everything from, oh, this person accidentally deleted a file, can you get it back? To, oh, we suspect that this person has been skimming money from the retirement fund. To, oh, we're afraid that some outside force, attacked our network. Can you look into it? He does all those investigations for this company specifically. Okay. The problem is, right now, digital forensics and cyber investigation is such a new field that there's very little regulation, whether it's government regulation or just self-regulation. Basically, right now, there are no licensing or training requirements to call yourself a cybercrime investigator. There is no requirement to calling yourself a digital forensics expert. There are certifications you can get. There are a ton of different certifications that say, like, you are a certified digital forensics examiner, or you're a certified access data software user, or you're certified this or certified that. But there is no set of those certifications that are standard, right? There's no set of those certifications that are required before you can call yourself a cyber investigator. So that is something that we're going to have to deal with as a field in the coming decades. And then these pictures, I know they're probably very, very hard to read, but there was a private group called HB Gary. They were, among other things, did cyber investigations. And they, as a private group, essentially poked the bear. They said they could investigate Anonymous and they could find all the ringleaders, even though there aren't really any ringleaders to Anonymous. But they promised the moon about investigating Anonymous, and Anonymous couldn't get away from them, and blah, blah, blah. Understandably, this upset Anonymous a little bit. So they took over basically all of the servers for the H.B. Gary company, and leaked all of their emails, which had some very embarrassing things in their emails, and caused H.B. Gary to cause them a lot of problems. So, if you learn anything from this, if you are in any kind of civil investigation position, don't poke the bear, right? Don't promise more than you can deliver, and don't tick off the people who have been doing this longer and more successfully than you have. So, other organizations that are involved in the investigation and prosecution and all the matters of civil investigation. So, the first one up there is IC3, the Internet Crime Complaint Center. Okay. Essentially, these guys, they're affiliated with a law enforcement organization, but they are a non-law enforcement organization, and their job is to collect complaints about different kinds of internet crime, right? So you might not want to report that your credit card got stolen to local law enforcement, but IC3 would ask that you please report it to them so that they can kind of keep track of what kind of cybercrime is occurring, how much is occurring, what the dollar values lost are. So these guys are kind of an information sharing and information conglomeration group, and they do a lot of advertisement and education and trying to both understand cybercrime and teach people about it so that it happens less. The second one on the list there, CERTs, those are computer emergency response teams. Okay, there are lots of these organized in different places by different other groups, and essentially their job is if somebody is a victim, some major crime happens, you can pay these computer emergency response teams to come in and they know how to fix the holes, they know how to gather evidence, they know how to preserve evidence, they know how to make sure it doesn't happen again, all these things. But you can call them in, and they're kind of the response team. They do the cleanup, they do the first part of the investigation, and then they'll hand it over to law enforcement once they get to that point. But these response teams are very good to kind of come in and be that first responder that a lot of times law enforcement can't be. And then there's WHOA, which is the Working to Halt Online Abuse. Okay, they're a NGO, non-government organization that's all volunteers, and essentially they are a resource group for harassment and stalking victims. So if you're cyber harassed or cyber stalked or whatever, and you need resources, you need somebody to tell you what your options are, you need help, you go to WHOA and they can help you and figure out what to do and where to go. Okay? International investigations. These become very, very complicated very quickly. Okay? If you're a victim in the United States and the bad guy is in, any other country, this is going to be a very, very difficult case for lots of reasons. First, it kind of stinks, but law enforcement will not perform any kind of investigation unless there is it reaches a certain level of seriousness. And seriousness is usually defined, unfortunately, it sucks, but usually defined with money lost, right? And in an absolute sense, not a relative sense, right? So if I make $50,000 a year and somebody steals $10,000 from me, um, that's not enough to really go after an international criminal. But if I'm $1 billion corporation and somebody steals $1 million, that is relatively much less of a big deal for them than the $10,000 was to me. But it's above that threshold, and now an international investigation is possible. Okay, but it has to reach a certain level of seriousness before law enforcement's gonna go into all the trouble that an international investigation entails. A lot of times there are political concerns, right? So the United States has to worry about international relations and politics and how they want to, whether they want to ask nicely or demand sternly or whatever. So, for instance, the United States is practically best buddies with the United Kingdom, right? So if there was some victim in the United States, we figure out that the bad guys in the UK, the FBI can, call up the British equivalent and say, hey, look, we're great friends. We've got all this evidence that one of your citizens committed this really horrible crime. Would you be nice and arrest him and send him to the United States, please? And the UK would probably be like, yeah, sure, no problem, because we get along really great, right? On the other hand, there are other countries in which we don't get along so good, or maybe we're in the middle of a big trade deal, right? Like Mexico. We're in the middle of trade negotiations all the time with Mexico, whether it's NAFTA or just any other kind of big economic international treaty negotiations that have really, really major financial impacts, right? So if the United States might be wary of demanding a criminal be arrested and given to the United States to face trial, if they think it might influence that other currently ongoing international negotiation. Make sense? And then, of course, there's the problem of extradition. Each country has to have an individual extradition treaty with another country, with every other country, if they want an extradition, right? So we have one extradition treaty with the UK, and that's very different from the extradition treaty we have with Brazil, which is different than the extradition treaty we have with Japan. But essentially, if somebody commits a crime in one of those countries, they can be arrested and sent to the other, right? So if an American commits a cybercrime against a Japanese citizen, we can extradite that person from America to Japan to face trial. But the United States does not have extradition treaties with every country. So like right now, I don't think we have an extradition treaty with Russia, which is why Edward Snowden is hiding in Russia right now, because the Russian government isn't about to arrest him and send him to us. So it is very difficult, if not impossible, if we find out that some Russian citizen committed a cybercrime against a U.S. citizen, that person's never going to face trial. Unless they voluntarily make a mistake and fly to the United States and we can be like, oh, look, you're on U.S. soil now, we can arrest you. The Russian government's never going to send him to the United States to face trial. It's just not going to happen. So there are a lot of other problems and challenges that come up with international investigations, but these are just a few of them, okay? And then finally, law enforcement and the government has to deal with issues of privacy, okay? Privacy is a very, very, very important issue, and it is one that really impacts kind of the cyber world. There were two recent events that really illustrate this challenge and this problem. Okay, the first was the San Bernardino shooting. A couple years ago, there was a guy in San Bernardino, California, and he committed an act of terrorism. He got a rifle, and him and I think his wife or his girlfriend shot a whole bunch of people. And they ended up dying at the end of it. Now, he had a Apple iPhone 5, and it was encrypted. And he was dead, so he couldn't give up the password. And the FBI didn't want to just try different passwords because the iPhone 5, among other cell phones, has a feature where if you get the wrong password, 5 or 10 or 15 times in a row, it will automatically brick the device, and then it's impossible to unlock it. So a court ordered Apple to assist the FBI in unlocking that phone. The court ordered Apple to kind of break its own encryption, to break its own security. And Apple really didn't want to do that. Because that tool, if it's developed, could be used to do a lot of bad things, right? So just because this one case, it might be used for good, doesn't mean that the technique and the tool and the software just goes away once that case is over. It still exists, and thus everybody else is at risk now too. And Apple wasn't willing to do that. This looked like it was going to head to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was going to make a decision about whether Apple could be forced to kind of break its own encryption, if you will. But before it got to the Supreme Court, the FBI found somebody else to essentially get around that security feature. It's rumored that the person they found to do that was Cellebrite, which is an Israeli company, but we don't know for sure. It has not been confirmed exactly who it was that was able to break that iPhone 5 security. The other one down there on the list is Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden worked for the National Security Agency, and he essentially got really, really upset at what the National Security Agency was doing. There was a lot of warrantless searches of citizens' data, a lot of warrantless collection of data from all kinds of private citizens, and he got really upset at the government violating people's privacy, and essentially he wrote up a huge exposure of everything they were doing and gathered a whole bunch of classified information from the NSA, leaked it to a bunch of reporters, and then he fled to Russia to hide out because what he did was vastly illegal. But he really showed the world that the United States government was doing some very shady things. They were violating a lot of people's privacy. Now, in the government's response was, if you want security, if you want to prevent terrorism, if you don't want another 9/11 to happen, these are the tools we're using to catch terrorists and prevent terrorism. But the opposite argument is that privacy is important. We have a constitution in this country that the government is not allowed to violate, and the things that the NSA was doing were arguably violating those constitutional rights. So that is an ongoing debate in the cyber world, and it'll be very interesting to see where that debate goes and how it ends up impacting life as an American and how it impacts the U.S. government and law enforcement's ability to collect data and work to stop cybercrime, work to stop cyber terror, and all those associated social ills. So, anyway, that is the end of Section 2. I will see you for Section 3.